A veteran and his dog helped an old man, then inherited his hidden lodge. They say some stories do not
Take it
begin
easy.
with
You
footsteps
took
or
a nasty
names,
fall.
but with a quiet stirring in the air, the kind that brushes against a weary heart and reminds it that even forgotten places still wait for light. On mornings like this, when winter held the world in a gentle hush, faith felt less like belief and more like a soft presence moving through the cold. Perhaps that is why the wind drifted the way it did across Frostpine Valley, slow and deliberate, as if carrying a message meant only for those who still chose kindness even when life had given them little in return. Under that pale stretch of sky, a man walked along the frost-rimmed shoulder of the road, his figure steady despite the weight of years that clung to him like an old coat. Ethan Rowe did not hurry. He rarely did anymore. Too much had been taken from him too quickly in the past, so now he moved through life the way one approaches a fragile door, quietly, respectfully, expecting nothing. His boots were worn thin at the edges, collecting powdery snow with each step, and his breath rose in calm, steady clouds that dissolved into the morning air before they ever reached the treetops. Beside him, Ranger padded with a soldier's patience, each paw leaving clean impressions in the frost. The German shepherd's coat, silver along the shoulders, darker toward the spine, caught the faint light like brushed metal. His ears flicked gently at every distant rustle, every shifting branch, every whisper the wind carried down from the ridgeline. There was no sense of urgency in them, only a quiet vigilance, as if the dog had long accepted that his purpose was simply to accompany, to sense the world on behalf of the man who walked beside him. Together, they crossed a landscape that looked untouched by time. Frost clung to the tall pines in thin crystalline sheets. The creek that wound through the valley murmured beneath a thin skin of ice, its voice soft, almost shy. Somewhere far off, a woodpecker tapped a slow rhythm into the dawn, the sound echoing as though the forest itself remembered an older heartbeat. The world felt vast, the kind of vast that made a person realize how small their troubles were compared to the sky above. Yet it did not feel lonely, only watchful, like nature itself was pausing to observe the quiet resilience of a man and his dog. Ethan lifted his gaze toward the thin veil of mist drifting between the trees. Light sifted through it in pale ribbons that bent and wavered with the wind. He didn't speak, but the stillness around him seemed to answer anyway, as if acknowledging the simple truth that sometimes surviving is its own kind of courage. Ranger slowed, his body stilled, not with fear, but with recognition. The kind of recognition that came before words, before thought, pure instinct, finely tuned through years of listening to the world more deeply than any human ever could. His breath puffed once, sharply, his ears angled toward the right side of the road. Then came the sign, a single, low chuff, almost inaudible, followed by a pause so complete it felt like the valley itself was holding its breath. The dog's eyes fixed on a patch of frost-covered ground near the tree line. Nothing moved there. No shadow shifted. No branch bent. And yet something waited. Ethan felt it without knowing what it was. A faint change in the air, a soft tremor of possibility, the unspoken promise that the day ahead would not be an ordinary one. Ranger's stance deepened, steady and alert. Whatever he sensed was subtle, quiet, tucked somewhere beneath the surface of the morning. Only enough to plant a question in the air. Only enough to make the heart lean forward. And in that stillness, as the frost glimmered and the wind circled once more through the tall pines, the world seemed to whisper that this was where the turning began. Now, let us return to our main character. The faint tension that Ranger sensed lingered in the cold air like a thin thread stretching toward something unseen. But Ethan moved forward with the same quiet steadiness that had carried him through years of wandering. His breath rose in soft clouds as he stepped toward the place where the dog had paused, his hand brushing lightly along Ranger's back as if to reassure him, though the truth was the reassurance went both ways. Nothing unusual greeted them at first glance, only a cluster of frost-laced pines and the pale shimmer of morning light settling over the valley. Still, Ranger's ears stayed lifted, alert but not alarmed, tuned to a world Ethan could not hear. Ethan slowed his pace, letting the silence settle around them. The soft crunch of snow beneath his boots and the gentle rhythm of Ranger's paws filled the quiet path forward. The road curved gently toward a small rise, where a wooden fence leaned under the weight of time and winter. Beyond it, the valley opened into a broad, sunlit clearing dotted with old birch trees whose white bark glowed faintly under the muted sky. A figure approached from the opposite direction, moving slowly with the help of a polished wooden cane. The man's coat fluttered with each step, the hem brushing against the frost. His shoulders were slightly hunched, but there was a calm determination in the way he pushed through the cold morning. Ethan noticed the man's breath was uneven, the kind of uneven that came from age rather than urgency. Ranger noticed something else. The dog's tail lowered, not in fear but in recognition of frailty. He stepped closer to Ethan, his body angled protectively but gently, a silent signal that someone needed help. As the man neared, the morning light caught the deep lines of his face. His silver hair peeked from beneath a wool cap, and his blue eyes, though dimmed by years, still held clarity. Ethan offered a polite nod, a gesture quiet enough not to startle. The older man tried to return the nod, but his cane slipped slightly on a patch of thin ice hidden beneath the frost. His foot wobbled, his balance shifted, and before the moment could fully form into danger, Ranger stepped forward with a firm, steady presence, letting out a single soft bark, more like a warning to the world than an alarm. Ethan reached out instinctively, his hand catching the man's elbow, steadying him until both feet found the ground again.
You took a nasty
The man
fall.
exhaled a breath of relief, his shoulders easing. He looked at Ethan with a gratitude that did not need many words. "Thank you, son," he murmured, his voice thin but warm. Ethan nodded once, modestly, as if the gesture required no acknowledgement at all. Ranger stood close, his amber eyes studying the man with a curious tenderness, sensing the tremor in his posture, the weight of years pressing down. The older man lifted his cane and tapped it lightly against the road as if testing it. "Ice sneaks up on you," he said with a faint smile. "Even after 80 years, it still wins more battles than I do." Ethan allowed a small smile of his own, the kind that appeared gently and faded just as quietly. "Road is slick this morning," he replied. "Glad you are all right." The man glanced at Ranger. "Fine dog you have there." Ranger tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging the compliment. The wind drifted in from the pines
completely
again,
rusted shut.
carrying a soft creak from
How long has
somewhere
it been like
beyond the
this?
clearing. It was a small sound,
Since the day he
almost
left.
nothing, but it brushed past Ethan like a reminder that the valley was watching, that something unseen had begun to shift. The older man straightened slowly, his breath settling. "Name is Amos Whitler," he said. "Live not far from here, but some days the ground feels farther than it used to." Ethan simply nodded, letting the man speak at his own pace. Ranger stayed still, ears angled toward the trees where the faint creak had come from, sensing the subtle disturbance in the quiet morning. The three of them stood there for a brief moment, the cold air weaving
I've
between
carried
them,
this secret
the sky
for so
pale
long.
and expectant,
I
as
know
if
it
waiting
doesn't
for the
excuse
next
what I
movement
did,
in a
but I need
story
you to
that
know
had
the
only
truth
just
before it's
begun.
too late.
Now, let us return to our main character. Amos Whitler stood for a moment as if gathering the rest of his strength from the cold air, then lifted his cane and motioned gently toward the path that curved deeper into the valley. Ethan sensed the hesitation in the man's posture, a subtle tremor, more from age than worry, and stepped closer in quiet support. Ranger watched them both with alert patience, his breath forming soft puffs in the crisp morning light. The older man began walking again, slower this time, careful with each placement of his cane. Ethan fell into step beside him, not crowding the man, simply offering presence. Ranger walked ahead by a few feet, moving with the steady confidence of a guide who understood that life often shifted in small, almost invisible ways before it ever changed in large ones. The clearing opened into a narrow stretch bordered by tall pines whose branches swayed gently under the weight of frost. Light filtered through the canopy in thin, drifting beams. The soft creak that Ranger had noticed earlier returned, carried faintly on a breeze that moved through the treetops like a whisper of something ancient. Amos paused again and turned slightly toward Ethan, his breath churning in small clouds. "These old woods," he said, "they have their own minds some days. They talk when they want to." Ethan glanced at the trees, not dismissive, but with the quiet understanding of someone who had spent enough time in lonely places to know that silence was rarely empty. "Seems peaceful out here," he said. "Peaceful can still surprise you." Amos replied with a small, knowing smile. Ranger lifted his head at that exact moment, ears angling sharply toward the upper ridge. His posture tightened with curiosity rather than alarm, as if he sensed a shift in the valley's quiet rhythm. He took several slow steps in the direction of the sound, then stopped, his paw hovering above the snow, waiting for something more. Amos followed Ranger's gaze. "He sees things clearer than I do," he murmured, almost to himself. Ethan watched Ranger, feeling the air change again, just slightly. Not colder, not warmer, just different, like a subtle pull guiding them towards something they had not yet been invited to understand. The older man adjusted his glove and tapped the cane against the ground. The sound echoed lightly, as though the earth beneath was hollow in places. Amos resumed his pace, but this time his steps turned toward a sloping path Ethan had not noticed before. It curved behind a dense row of spruce trees, revealing a quieter part of the valley. Ranger moved ahead with more intention, nose brushing the frosty air. It seemed he sensed a direction long before any human eye could catch the reason. Amos slowed as they entered the narrowing trail, gripping his cane a little tighter. "Used to walk this path every morning," he said softly. "These days it walks me instead." Ethan offered a gentle nod. "You must know the land well." Amos smiled faintly. "Well enough to know when it wants to share something." Ahead, Ranger stopped once more. This time he did not move at all. His posture became perfectly still, ears pointed forward, tail lowered in focused awareness. Ethan recognized the stance. It was not one of warning but of attention, the kind that meant something in the world around them had shifted just a little closer to being known. Amos breathed out slowly, following the dogs. Line of sight to a thicket of overgrown brush halfway up the incline. It looked ordinary at first, frosted leaves, tangled branches, a dusting of snow. Then the wind brushed through it with a strange gentleness, stirring only the center of the thicket while the outer branches remained perfectly still. Ethan felt a quiet prickle move along his skin, the way one might feel when stepping into an old room where secrets had waited too long for company. Ranger took one careful step forward and uttered a soft, questioning sound deep in his throat. Amos's eyes softened with something between memory and recognition. "There," he whispered. "Your dog feels it too." Ethan did not speak. He only listened, to Ranger's steady breathing, to the whisper of trees above, to the way the valley seemed to lean in closer, as if awaiting their next step. The moment hung suspended, delicate and certain. Something waited just beyond that thicket. Something that had been quiet for a very long time. Now, let us return to our main character. The thicket ahead held its silence with an almost deliberate patience.
Take it easy.
As if it had been waiting for footsteps to return after many forgotten years. Ranger stood perfectly still, his breath rising in soft white clouds, his amber eyes fixed on the shifting center of the brush where the wind moved in a way that did not match the rest of the valley. Ethan stepped forward slowly, careful not to disturb whatever presence lingered beneath the frost. Amos paused beside him, leaning slightly on his cane, his gaze thoughtful rather than afraid. "That place has been quiet a long time," he murmured, his voice low, carrying the weight of memory. Ethan watched the branches sway, their movements subtle and rhythmic, not frantic like a gust of wind, but gentle, almost intentional. "What is it?" he asked softly. Amos exhaled, the sound thin and distant. "A reminder," he said, "of something I left alone too long." Ranger took another quiet step closer, his nose lowering toward the frost-covered ground, as if he sensed a faint trail or an echo of a scent hidden
How long has it been like
the
this?
earth. The dog's ears flicked once,
the day he
twice, then angled forward again, focused with an uncanny precision that made Ethan's pulse shift in a way he could not quite explain. Amos reached into his coat pocket, his gloved hand trembling slightly with age rather than emotion. When he withdrew it, he held a small metal key, worn and dulled from time, its edges softened as though hundreds of winters had pressed against it. Ethan recognized the shape immediately, the same kind of key he had seen earlier glinting in Amos's pocket, though this one carried deeper scratches and a faint engraving near the top. Amos turned the key over in his hand, studying it as if reacquainting himself with an old truth. "I should have come back sooner," he said quietly. "But time is faster than a man expects." Ethan waited, not pushing, letting the older man speak in his own slow rhythm. The frosted wind drifted between them, carrying the faint scent of pine and cold earth. Amos pointed his cane toward the thicket. Behind those branches, he continued, there is a place I built many years ago. A place I meant to share with someone. But that moment never came, and so the door stayed shut. Ranger's ears twitched again. This time he moved with more intent, circling toward the left side of the thicket where the frost had melted in a thin, uneven line, exposing a narrow strip of dark soil beneath. Ethan followed his path with his eyes, noticing the odd contrast in temperature. The ground around them was frozen solid, yet the area Ranger approached seemed touched by a warmth that did not belong to the morning. Amos watched too, his eyes softening as though he recognized a long-lost pattern. Your dog, he said softly. He feels the heartbeat of the land. Some creatures listen better than people ever could. Ranger lowered his head and pressed his nose to a cluster of branches, then stepped back slightly, letting out a low, soft sound, not a warning, but discovery. Ethan stepped forward, carefully moving aside a few brittle branches. What lay beneath was unexpected. Not a hollow, not a burrow, but the faint outline of old wooden beams, half buried in leaves and time. The shape was small, almost imperceptible unless one looked closely. But Ranger had found it with certainty. Amos approached slowly, his cane sinking gently into the softened soil as though the ground welcomed his return. There it is, he whispered. The doorway. Ethan looked at the wooden outline again, its corners softened by age, its surface marked by the years it had spent hidden from the world. To what? He asked softly. Amos lifted the key, its metal glinting faintly in the muted daylight. To a lodge, he said. A little place I built higher up the ridge. Locked the entrance from down here to keep it safe. Life carried me away before I ever brought anyone to see it. Ranger sat beside the outline of the hidden beams, his posture calm, as if giving permission for the truth to rise again. Ethan felt the valley's breath shift around them, gentle and expectant. A secret long kept was leaning toward the light. Now, let us return to our main character. Amos held the small key in his weathered hand for a long moment, as if feeling the weight of every year it had spent waiting in silence. The frost around the buried beams glimmered faintly, catching the filtered light that slipped through the trees. Ranger remained seated beside the outline in the earth, his posture steady, his presence almost reverent, as though he understood that something long forgotten was ready to rise again. Ethan watched Amos closely, sensing the quiet mixture of hesitation and resolve in the older man's expression. If it has been locked all this time, Ethan said gently, we do not have to open it right away. Amos breathed out a thin, wavering sigh, soft enough to disappear into the cold air. Some doors, he answered, call you back whether you are ready or not. Slowly, he lowered himself beside the thicket, brushing aside the frost-covered branches with trembling hands. The wooden outline beneath revealed itself more clearly now, aged planks tucked into the earth at an angle, like the top frame of something built long ago and forgotten beneath seasons of wind and snow. The key trembled slightly in Amos's hand. Ethan knelt to assist, not to take over, only to steady the branches so the older man could move without strain. When Amos located the thin metal loop embedded in the wood, he closed his fingers around it with a familiarity that surprised even him. I put this here when my wife was still alive, he murmured quietly. She said we should finish the lodge together. We never did. His words drifted between them, not heavy, not sorrowful, only touched with the gentle ache of memory. Ranger leaned forward, sniffing the wooden frame, then glanced up at Ethan with a soft, deliberate blink, as if urging them onward. Amos slid the key into the narrow slot, the metal meeting the lock with a faint, muted click. It was a sound both fragile and certain, a sound that felt like time shifting under their feet. Ethan felt the cold air stir around them, carrying the faint scent of old pine and still air trapped beneath the earth. Amos gripped the metal loop and gave it a careful pull. The wooden panel moved only slightly at first, resisting as if unsure whether it wished to be disturbed. Then, slowly, it lifted, revealing a concealed entrance tucked deep beneath the frost and leaves. A thin breath of warmer air drifted upward, carrying with it a scent of aged cedar and dust, the smell of a place sealed away long enough for the world above to forget it existed. There is a staircase, Amos whispered, leaning forward to peer inside. Ethan steadied him by the elbow, offering silent support as the older man shifted his weight. The steps below descended into dimness, but they were sturdy, built from thick timber and reinforced with iron brackets. Ranger stood at the edge of the opening, his ears pricked, nose tilted toward the slight draft that rose from below. His tail lowered in careful curiosity, but he showed no fear.
How long has it been like this?
He simply waited, as if he trusted whatever lay beneath.
Since the day he left.
I built it to last, Amos said with a sigh. Even when everything else in life was falling apart, I wanted this place to stand. Ethan could hear the tremor in the man's voice, but it was not from weakness. It was emotion held steady for too many years. The wind rustled the branches above them, brushing across the opening like a hand passing over a long and used doorway. The valley seemed to hold its breath. You too should see it, Amos said softly. My knees will not let me go far anymore, but it deserves someone who can look upon it with fresh eyes.
I've carried this
He
secret
extended
for so
the key
long.
toward Ethan,
I
pressing
know
it gently into his palm.
what I did, but I
The
need
metal
you to know
felt
the
warm,
truth before it's
as if it
too
had
late.
captured the memory of every morning Amos once stood here with hope. Ranger looked up at Ethan, his gaze steady, encouraging. Ethan closed his fingers around the key, feeling a quiet shift inside himself, the sense that he had stepped into a story larger than anything he expected when he woke that morning. The hidden entrance waited below, patient and untouched, holding secrets shaped by time and loneliness, and the unspoken wish that someone would someday come to open them. Now, let us return to our main character. The key rested in Ethan's palm with a quiet warmth, as if it carried the memory of every season Amos had once hoped to share with someone. The hidden entrance below breathed out a faint whisper of air, carrying with it the dry scent of old cedar and untouched rooms waiting for footsteps they had not heard in decades. Ranger stepped closer to the opening, lowering his head to peer into the dim descent. His ears shifted gently, not in alarm but in recognition, as though something inside called to his instincts in a language older than words. Ethan took a steady breath, letting the cold morning settle around him before he began to move. He descended the first step slowly, testing the strength of the timber. It held firm beneath his weight. Ranger followed without hesitation, placing each paw with measured confidence. The faint glow of daylight faded as they moved deeper, replaced by a muted amber tone reflecting off the wooden walls. The staircase led to a small landing where another wooden door waited, its surface smooth with age and carved with simple patterns of pine branches. Amos remained above, watching with a mixture of anticipation and gentle longing. It has been many years since anyone touched that door, he said, his voice drifting down the staircase like a breath carried on memory. Ethan lifted the key once more, feeling the subdued hum of possibility as he slid it into the lock. The soft metallic clink echoed through the narrow space, a fragile but determined sound. With a slow turn, the latch gave way, and the door creaked open, not in protest but in welcome, as if it remembered being built with love and intention. A soft warmth drifted out, surprising in a place so long hidden. It carried hints of cedar, dried herbs, and the distant trace of a home that had once been cherished. Ranger stepped inside first, his nose lifting, tail swaying in slow, curious arcs. Ethan followed, his boots meeting a polished wooden floor coated lightly in dust, untouched yet preserved by the sealed space. The room opened into a cozy entry area with paneled walls, a small stone hearth, and a table crafted from pine. Everything seemed suspended in time, waiting for a door to open and for life to return. Sunlight filtered in through narrow windows carved into the hillside, catching particles of dust and turning them into drifting sparks. The light was thin but warm, giving the lodge the quiet glow of a memory still alive beneath the surface. Ethan stepped deeper into the room, brushing his fingertips along the back of a wooden chair. The craftsmanship was careful and personal. He could feel the intention in every curve and joint. Ranger wandered toward a small wool blanket folded neatly on a bench, sniffing it before turning his gaze back to Ethan with a thoughtful tilt of his head. Amos's voice drifted faintly from above. It was meant to be a place for rest, he said, though Ethan could tell he spoke more to the room than to either of them. A place where life could slow down enough for joy to catch up. Ethan took in the shelves filled with hand-carved figurines, the small framed sketches pinned neatly along the walls, the hammer and chisel resting on a table as if their owner had stepped out for only a moment. None of it felt abandoned. It felt paused, held, waiting. Ranger moved toward a closed door at the far end of the lodge, pausing just long enough to signal something on the other side. His ears shifted, registering a sound too gentle for human hearing. Ethan approached with measured steps, placing his hand on the old brass handle. The air around him seemed to settle in anticipation, the kind of stillness that appeared in sacred places. He opened the door. Inside, a small room waited, lined with shelves and bathed in soft light from a narrow window. In the center stood a wooden workbench, covered in tools and unfinished carvings. A single piece of wood rested on the bench, shaped into the early form of a cabin perfectly matching the one above the hillside. Ethan felt something quiet move in his chest, an old familiarity rising in a place he had never been before. Ranger sat beside him, perfectly still, as if honoring the moment. Behind them, Amos's voice trembled slightly as he spoke down the staircase. "I thought one day I would finish it," he said, "but life asked me to wait." Ethan let the silence settle, gentle and profound. The room breathed with stories left untold, with love that had never been forgotten. And in that moment, he knew the valley had opened this door not by chance, but by need. Now, let us return to our main character. The small wooden room held its breath as Ethan stood before the unfinished carving, his hand hovering just above the smooth granite. The piece felt alive in its stillness, carrying the quiet persistence of someone who had once shaped it with hope rather than haste.
It's completely
Ranger's
rusted
steady
shut.
presence beside him grounded
How
the
long
moment.
has it been like this?
The dog's warm breath rising in slow
Since the day
clouds
he
that
left.
mingled with the soft light filtering in through the narrow window. For a long while, Ethan did not speak. The stillness inside the lodge did not ask him to. It simply welcomed him, settling around him like a gentle hand on his shoulder. He traced a fingertip along the edge of the wooden cabin, noticing how precise the lines were, how carefully Amos had carved the roof slope, how the doorway mirrored the entrance they had just walked through. It was as though the older man had tried to capture a memory of the place even as he built it, preserving a moment in time
I've
before
carried
time
this
itself
secret for
changed
so long.
everything. Ranger's
I know
ears
it doesn't
twitched as a
excuse
faint
what I
sound
did, but I
rose
need
from
you to
behind
know the
them,
truth
a
before it's
soft
too
creak
late.
of timber shifting in the hillside. It was not a sound of warning, but a reminder that the hill above was alive in its own quiet way. Amos's voice drifted down the staircase again, carrying with it a gentleness that could only come from someone who had learned to live with both regret and gratitude. "I used to come down there every morning after my wife passed," he said softly. "Sat by that window with a cup of weak coffee, trying to remember what peace sounded like." Ethan listened without turning, giving the older man the dignity of being heard without scrutiny. Ranger stepped toward the workbench, placing one paw gently against the wooden leg, as if acknowledging the significance of the unfinished work. Ethan exhaled slowly. "This place meant a lot to you," he said. It was not a question. Amos descended the first few steps cautiously, stopping where the light from the lower room touched his boots. He leaned slightly on his cane, the carved handle catching the amber glow. "It was meant to be a start," he replied. "Life changes shape when you grow old. You think you have time to finish the things you begin." His gaze drifted past Ethan, settling on the carvings, the dust-coated shelves, the tiny particles of light floating in the quiet air like drifting memories. "Then one day you find that time has its own plans." Ethan moved aside so Amos could see more clearly, but he did not urge him to come down. The steps were steep, and the older man's breath had already begun to thin. Amos smiled faintly anyway, appreciating the view from where he stood. "You and your dog," he murmured. "You stepped into a place that has been waiting for company a very long time." Ranger turned his head at the sound of Amos's voice, his amber eyes soft with the understanding that only loyal creatures carry. Then, with deliberate slowness, he approached Ethan and nudged his hand once, a wordless encouragement to bridge the silence. Ethan nodded, more to himself than anyone else. He looked around the lodge again, taking in every detail, the way the dust settled gently over the carved figurines, how the stones in the hearth retained their shape despite years without flame, how the light from outside softened the corners of the room rather than exposing its age. It was not abandonment he felt here. It was waiting. A long, patient waiting. "It is a beautiful place," Ethan said quietly. Amos lowered his gaze. Places can hold dreams, he said, but they need someone to carry them forward. Ranger let out a soft, low exhale, almost a sigh, then walked back toward the staircase and sat facing Amos, as if inviting him to share something more. Amos's hand tightened on the railing, not from strain, but from emotion. I kept thinking I would bring someone here, he whispered, to show them that a person can build a little hope with his own hands. But the years moved faster than I did. Ethan felt the weight of the older man's regret, not heavy, but tender. He stepped closer to the stairs, lifting his face so Amos could meet his eyes through the dimming light. You brought us here, he said simply. Maybe that is what this place needed. The valley outside shifted with a gentle sigh of wind, brushing against the hillside, making the wooden beams murmur softly in reply. Ranger turned his attention toward the entrance above, sensing something changing in the air, something subtle and unmistakably human. Amos's breath wavered, his fingers gripping the railing. Ethan took a quiet step upward, concerned but composed, ready to steady the older man should he need it. The lodge seemed to lean into the moment with them, its silence deepening, its memory opening. Something unseen was beginning to turn. Now, let us return to our main character. Amos steadied himself on the railing, his breath moving in shallow waves that trembled with more than the winter air. Ethan climbed 2 steps toward him, not rushing, simply offering his presence like a quiet anchor in the shifting moment. Ranger stood at the base of the stairs, his amber eyes fixed upward, reading Amos with an intuition sharpened by years of watching over fragile things. The older man drew in a slow breath, pressing a hand against his chest, not in pain, but in the soft ache of emotion long held back. It is strange, Amos murmured, his voice barely louder than the whisper of wind through the hillside. You build something hoping it will outlive your loneliness. Then one day you realize the loneliness was waiting for the right company. Ethan did not answer. Words felt too small for the tenderness in the older man's voice.
Take it easy.
Instead,
You took a
he
nasty
moved
fall.
one step closer, ready to steady him if needed. Amos lifted his gaze, his eyes glistening with the softness of someone seeing a long-held dream take shape again. I thought I would finish this place for my wife, he said. She always believed a home should feel like someone's heart was built into the walls. His fingers brushed the railing, tracing the grain of the wood. But after she passed, I worked in silence. Every board, every carving, it was my way of keeping her close. The light from the lower room drifted gently upward, casting a warm glow on Amos's face. It softened the lines carved by decades of winters, revealing the gentler man beneath the years. Ranger climbed 1 step, then another, his movements deliberate and calm. He reached Amos's side and pressed his head lightly against the man's leg, offering a grounding warmth. Amos's hands settled on the dog's fur, grateful and steadying. The simple contact seemed to ease the tremor in his breath.
How long has it been
You
like
feel
this?
things, do you not? Amos whispered
Since
to
the day
Ranger,
he left.
always before the rest of us. Ranger blinked slowly, a gesture that felt almost like understanding. Ethan stood near enough to catch the soft shift in Amos's expression, the quiet surrender of someone realizing he had carried too much alone for too long. This lodge, Amos said, lifting his gaze toward Ethan, was meant to be a gift, not in the sense of something owned, but something shared, something that needed people who understand what it means to lose and still choose kindness. Ethan felt the weight of those words settle into him, not heavy,
I've carried
but
this secret
meaningful.
for so
He
long.
knew loss. He
I
knew
know
what
it
it meant to
doesn't
walk
excuse
roads
what I
with
did,
nothing
but I
but a
need you to
loyal
know the
dog,
truth
and the
before
hope
it's
that
too
life
late.
might one day soften its edges. Amos inhaled slowly, steadying himself once more. You and your dog, you walked into my morning without asking for anything. But sometimes the world brings the right souls together when an old promise is ready to surface again. The wind outside shifted, brushing along the hillside with a gentle sigh. It rattled a thin branch above the entrance, and the sound echoed softly through the stairwell like a quiet affirmation. Amos's grip on the railing loosened just slightly, as if a long-held tension was finally releasing. His eyes found Ethan's again, filled with something like peace. I cannot give the years back to myself, he said, but I can give this place to someone who will understand it. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but Ranger moved before he could, stepping between them and looking from one face to the other as if he already understood where the moment was leading. Amos managed a faint laugh, one touched by both gratitude and acceptance. "Your guardian here," he said, motioning toward Ranger. He knew this morning would matter more than any other. A quiet stillness settled between them, the kind that appears when life aligns itself without effort. Amos looked down the staircase once more, his eyes softening as he gazed into the warm light of the hidden lodge. "It is time," he whispered. "Time to let someone else finish what I began." Ethan felt the valley breathe with them, as though the land itself acknowledged the turning of an old page. Ranger stepped forward, laying a paw gently on the next stair, as if sealing the unspoken promise beginning to form. Something sacred had shifted, delicate and undeniable. "Now, let us return to our main character." The air around the hillside seemed to soften as Amos released his quiet confession, and for a moment the world held still, as though honoring the weight of everything he had carried. Ethan stood one step below him, feeling the shift not just in the older man's voice, but in the space itself, as if the lodge, the valley, and the morning light all leaned closer to listen. Ranger remained beside Amos, steady and patient, sensing a turning point only he could truly understand. Amos lowered himself carefully onto the top stair, resting both hands on his cane, as if gathering the strength to speak the truth he had held too long. "I have no children," he said softly. "No family left who remembers the promises I made or the dreams I tucked into this place." He looked down the staircase toward the warm glow inside the lodge, the lines of his face softening with something tender. "But I always hoped that someone with a good heart would find it." Ethan listened, unmoving, honoring the moment with silence. The older man's voice trembled but did not break. "Life has a way of circling back," Amos continued. "Sometimes it brings us exactly who we need, even if only for a little while." Ranger shifted closer, leaning gently into Amos's leg as though urging him to go on. Amos reached down, brushing his fingers over the dog's fur, grateful for the grounding warmth. "You saved me this morning," the old man whispered. "You did not hesitate. You did not ask for anything. That kind of kindness deserves a place to rest." Ethan felt a familiar ache rise in his chest, one born of years spent wandering with no place to belong, no home that carried his name. The idea of someone offering him something so meaningful felt too large to hold, yet too honest to refuse. Amos slowly reached inside his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope, its edges worn from years of being carried close. He held it out to Ethan with a steadying breath. "This was prepared a long time ago," he said. "I kept it with me in case the day ever came when I met the right person." Ethan accepted the envelope, feeling the faint weight of paper inside. His fingers hesitated at the flap, but Amos shook his head gently. "Not here," he murmured. "The lodge will understand before you do." Ranger let out a low, encouraging sound, nudging Ethan's hand before stepping back down the staircase, guiding him toward the lodge like a guardian fulfilling his duty. Ethan descended the steps with the envelope held carefully, the warm light from the hidden room washing over him as he reached the bottom. The lodge seemed different now, as if awakening. Dust motes drifted slower, touched by a quiet glow. The carved figurines along the shelves caught the light in new angles, showing details Ethan had not noticed before. Ranger sat by the wooden table, watching with calm certainty.
You took a nasty
Ethan
fall.
opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink faded but steady. It was a deed. His breath caught as he read the words. "I, Amos Whitler, leave the Frostpine Lodge and all land surrounding it to the one who helps me when I fall." There was no date, no name, only that one condition, written in handwriting that trembled slightly, but spoke with absolute clarity. A soft sound escaped Ethan, not disbelief, but something deeper, an exhale born from long wandering finally slowing. Ranger walked toward him, pressing his head into Ethan's side, sealing the truth of the moment with quiet understanding. Amos's voice drifted down from above, faint but warm. "You did not just help me stand," he said. "You helped me remember I was not alone." Ethan closed his eyes, letting the truth settle into the quiet spaces of his heart. The lodge, untouched and waiting for years,
It's
felt
completely
suddenly
rusted
full,
shut.
as though breathing for the first
How long has it
time
been
in a
like
long
this?
while. He looked up the staircase to where
Since the day
Amos
he
stood
left.
silhouetted by winter light. The older man watched him with a gentle smile, one touched with sadness but also with peace. "Take care of it," Amos whispered. "Take care of yourself in it." The valley exhaled with them, brushing through the trees in a hushed sweep of wind. Ranger stepped beside Ethan, steady and ready, as if already embracing their new beginning. Now, let us return to our main character.